D&D has been on a steady decline over the past 6 years, and it's honestly pretty boring. Hello, Jamers. I am Jamer2. Welcome to the weekly bitching session about something that's not actually consequential to everyday life. Yes, I'm a man of my niches here. I've been playing D&D consistently since 2019, and I kind of feel like I've hit a bit of a wall on my personal enjoyment of the game, specifically as someone who likes building character concepts. Like, to make it clear, my DMs have made their games very entertaining, whether it's homebrew or modules. A major part of D&D for me is the character class mechanics and creating something that my brain can actually chew on. If a character build isn't like a tough piece of taffy for me that I can really chew on to figure out how to work, then I don't really have as much fun with the mechanics as other people. And I know a big factor of it is that we as players tend to fall into habits. People will fall back into the same classes or the same species, or play things very similar every time. There's spells that just work for the most effective builds, especially when playing in the context of the Forgotten Realms. And the thing is that, as a player, I've gotten pretty good at creating optimized builds. I've actually had DMs get nervous whenever I come up with a build because my characters can inadvertently wipe an entire combat encounter, to the point where I've had some DMs have to scale up encounters for it just to be a challenge to the party due to my presence. It's why I pulled back from playing Paladin, despite being one of my favorite classes, because I know exactly how to make hyper-effective killing machines. Now, I know the common answer is that I should just look into playing a different class that I'm not as familiar with, and that's the thing. I've played every single standard character class in D&D. From Artificer to Wizard, over the past 8 years, I've played every character class with a wide variety of species and subclasses. I've gotten to the point where I've started picking quote-unquote less optimal subclasses or origins just to give myself some spice. And I know there's a ton of homebrew classes out there. Who knows, I might take really well to Bloodhunter or Gunslinger. There's a ton of homebrew classes that are reflective of other systems like Pathfinder, which, yes, I know Pathfinder is based on an older version of D&D, but shh. It's something that people are more familiar with and will be able to make effective comparisons with. Which, speaking of Pathfinder, I kind of find it insane how many tiny tweaks were made to the methodology that helps make the combat loop feel fresh again. Despite the fact that you have similar methods with skill specialties, the action economy and damage balancing are made in such a way that it actually feels challenging again. And it kind of got me thinking on what makes D&D an interesting game by comparison, and what I realized is that I think the game's failings are primarily a byproduct of playing it too safe. TTRPGs are essentially a sandbox tool where the enjoyment is driven directly by the players, the community, and the dungeon master. You could have one DM providing a grimdark, gritty experience bordering on Call of Cthulhu, and the next week you have a DM sending people into Candyland where you level by helping herd cotton candy sheep. The success of TTRPGs is directly reflective of the community and their contributions rather than those who are actually making the base game, and I think that's directly the problem. D&D as a brand has been playing it so safe with their publications and editions that, for lack of a better word, it's like mixing store-brand peanuts into your Planters peanuts. The odds of having new peanuts taste slightly different is very low, and for some people, having just peanuts is fine. But when you play a game for nearly a decade on a pretty frequent basis, you're gonna start getting tired of just peanuts, and you're gonna start needing trail mix. Becoming a professional DM has also enhanced this thought process for me. As soon as I started earning money by running D&D games, the more and more that I noticed the game's shortcomings. Even when my players bring in homebrew subclasses, there's still a certain predictability that comes where I can anticipate what they're going to do after a session or two of seeing that subclass. And the thing is that I could create encounters that counter these features, but I think that's just a lazy route for a DM to take. Like, if you have a party who puts out a bunch of radiant damage, making an enemy that's immune to radiant damage doesn't make the encounter more fun. It just makes the enemy more of a damage sponge and draws out the encounter as a whole. Punishing your players due to the mechanical shortcomings of the games doesn't make a good game. If anything, it's just going to be frustrating to them and damage your relationship with your players. To make it clear, I'm not saying that you can't have some enemies that are immune to a damage type. Dragons are kind of the epitome of that principle because they're immune to one type of damage. However, what makes a dragon's encounter interesting is that while they have an immunity, it's often of a damage type that classes aren't purely reliant on to be effective. Even a wizard can end up working around if they tend to spam fireball. It's why werewolves and other lycanthropes have kind of become a joke in D&D 5e, because you either have a pain-in-the-ass fight where any melee attacker is screwed over unless they have a magic or silvered weapon, or if they do have said weapon, the fight just becomes a complete joke. You have to build your encounters in the context of what your party looks like. A barbarian, fighter, monk, and rogue are going to be challenged in different ways compared to a cleric, warlock, wizard, and sorcerer. And obviously I know that there's the concept of party balancing and players working together, but you're not always going to have that. If you run a campaign where you have randoms coming in with character sheets and it's not a group of friends working together to optimize, the odds of your party working well together is reduced. And this is where one of my initial criticisms of D&D comes around, which is that the effectiveness of a game's enjoyment is directly reflective of a DM's skills and understanding of the game. Modules officially published by Wizards of the Coast are essentially a sandbox where you're provided some basic encounters, maps, and puzzles. And if you're playing with casual players who don't know all the ins and outs of the game mechanics, then it can be interesting for them on a first run. But if you have a party of more experienced players, or a mixed party of people with varying levels of skills, that's where the challenge comes in. I don't mean this as a critique of the writers of D&D modules, because I know that when they make these modules, they have to make the games the lowest common denominator in mind. If you get too specific with your plot and storyline, it restricts your player characters too much, which kind of removes the sandbox effect. However, if you have a DM who doesn't know how to write an intriguing story, or doesn't have skills in piecing narrative points together in a cohesive manner, you're basically going to have a collection of combat and roleplay encounters, with the eventual goal just getting to point B at the end. The basic version of Tomb of Annihilation basically involves you getting hired by a woman who died and came back to life. She teleports you to Chult and drops you into this world of, go find the cure to the death curse! And you essentially go on a wild goose chase and dick around leveling up until you get to the last third of the plot, which is where things actually become relevant again. And due to the time limit of 75 days, odds are your boss is already dead and consumed by the Atropol. Speedrunning a D&D game defeats the purpose, which makes me question why they added this feature in the first place. There's a narrative principle that everyone who watches video essays about writing knows about, which is Chekhov's gun. If you show a gun on the wall in the first act, the expectation is it's going to fire in the third act, and yes, I know Tomb of Annihilation is a 9-year-old module, may not be as reflective of modern modules. I don't give a shit about 5.5e, we'll get to that later. But here's the thing. Despite being on the cover of the module, a Serac does not canonically appear once in the module until you get to the final boss room, where you don't even get to kill him because a Serac's too important to the Forgotten Realms lore. You basically spend all this time and resources to fight the source of all of this suffering, only for him to fuck off because, ooh, we can't kill our big bad lich who makes all the dungeons for us. And I know that the principle of keeping things vague is so that the DM has wiggle room to tell their own story, but when a satisfying resolution to your campaign might require a follow-up sequel to tie up loose ends, that's bad writing. Yes, I know, this is one of my Remy freaking out about the soup moments, but think about it this way. D&D is a game that's meant to be fun. If your story is garbage, then your game will rely purely on combat loops and the setting to make up for it. I won't lie that Chult is a pretty interesting setting on its own. I mean, it's a jungle peninsula with dinosaurs and cool stone temples. And a lot of spiders I had to remove because one of my players is arachnophobic. I love you. But that's okay. Player comfort comes first. The combat loops are mid at best. I know this is a byproduct of running a 1 through 13 campaign, but until you get past level 6, D&D plays pretty much the same regardless of which setting you'll come across. There's some unique things to Chult, like the big plant that tries to eat people, and the B-Rex. Stay tuned for that in Tomb at a time. I just question the depiction of certain cultures in base Tomb, and when a pasty white boy like me is kind of side-eyeing some of that stuff, you know it's pretty bad. I've basically been this buzzing little man of anxiety disorders because the best I can do is try to research actual culture and make the setting better reflective of the region rather than, hee-hoo, look at all these people that feed other people the dinosaurs when they're in trouble, meh. It's such a huge struggle because at what point does my attempt to respectfully represent and adapt aspects of a range of cultures become appropriation? Like, the Feathered Lance, for instance. I can't give everything away about her plot-wise, but she's essentially inspired by a Dumu, which is a traditional jumping dance practiced by the Maasai people combined with, well, a secretary bird. You might have noticed that in her art. But, you know, that's because her enemies are snake-themed, so, lore. And the thing is, a lot of DMs aren't going to be thinking about this sort of stuff. In a casual setting, when you're just playing with friends around the table, the odds of you running into these shortcomings is very low. And it kind of ties into the responsibility of storytellers to represent cultures responsibly, especially in an era where we have people deliberately being abrasive or just straight up racist because they've been emboldened by assholes. And the last thing I want to do is unintentionally come off as someone who's being deliberately insensitive or fall into a lot of storytelling pitfalls. but I also acknowledge that at the end of the day, I am a chronically ill little white man with limited life experience and the cultural upbringing of unseasoned beans on toast. So the best I can do is apologize if I fuck up while trying to make up for the shortcomings of the base material. When I talked to my players about the homebrew section of the campaigns, there was almost this unanimous sentiment that the things that I made by hand were more compelling than what was provided by the base game. All the intrigue and things that my players have been interested in aren't a byproduct of what the module has to provide, but rather the plot that I've personally spent hours thinking about and adapting to the changes provided by the party. Which, by the way, little tip for DMs and players alike, but you can't really script a campaign like a book or a show. When I run stuff like Tomb, I plan stuff maybe 1 to 2 sessions ahead, minus major locations. If you have a DM who's either scripting or running entire encounters by the book, or worse, affecting player autonomy to get the story to go exactly how they want to, run? I say this because I've seen this sort of pitfall in the past and have fallen into it myself. Like, one of the worst things you can do as a DM is take away the autonomy of the players or force them into a situation to suit the narrative. I'm not perfect about this nowadays, but if you have a major moment happening that will negatively impact the party, you need to have options if they manage to outsmart it rather than punishing them into that as a result. Using Tomb again as an example, there's a bit in one of the more recent episodes where Xerxes is essentially locked into the spaceship and mind-controlled by a Serac remotely. While it's something I plan on as a possibility, I also considered the chance of the party not letting him hook into the system at all. Hell, I couldn't predict Gru's trying to talk to him through her brain, so that was an improvised moment. And that's the thing about D&D. If you can't improvise or be light on your feet, then you probably aren't suited to DMing. I've seen a lot of people get frustrated where their players will end up throwing them off or their plans because, well, the players either solved a puzzle in the way they weren't expecting, or they ended up changing the path of the story completely, either by killing an NPC early or just doing something smart. A major factor of D&D is the moment-to-moment sillies of the players working in the sandbox, and the DM has to work alongside them, not against them. As a DM, your job isn't meant to be you versus the players. Sure, you're the one providing the challenges and the encounters, but if you're antagonistic or controlling towards your players, then it's just gonna make everyone miserable. Like, if you want to control all these fancy story moments and have things go exactly how you want to, you're probably better off writing a book or something where you have more control over the story. Rounding back to my critiques of D&D itself, I've been calling base D&D mid, and that's because I think it's gone unchallenged for so long that the owners of the franchise have gotten complacent. It's essentially become the Marvel movie of TTRPGs, where it makes a ton of money and they're able to continue putting out stuff that appeals to new players, but unfortunately, experienced players aren't provided with a challenging experience. There's essentially the expectation that they'll continue to make money with expansions because, well, people are either starving for content or they don't want to go down the rabbit hole for homebrew stuff. And I think a contributing factor is that a lot of DMs are scared about going out of their comfort zones. I'm not talking about inexperienced DMs. The best way to learn how to DM is to start with the base modules and use them as a springboard to learn, but it also delves into the new challenge bad thought process, and when I look at 5.5e, it just kind of feels reminiscent of that. Like, on one hand, there's new mechanics and subclasses in 5.5, but let me ask you this. When was the last time we got a new main class? Wizard has been the only intelligence-focused primary class in 5e for 12 years along Artificer, which means that unless your DM is comfortable with homebrew and you want to be in an int class, you're basically a pinholed into these two options. And even then, the Artificer's use of intelligence is only for casting and infusions. There's no intelligence-based way equivalent to, say, the Hexblade Warlock outside of Bladesinger, and even then, that's still Wizard. The game has become very notorious for simplifying things down and making the action economy very palatable. It's unironically to the point where BG3 introduced drinking potions as a bonus action, and I had to permanently change my house rules because it was the first major change since Tasha's came out that I actually felt makes sense. I'm saying all of these not because I dislike the game, but because myself and a lot of veteran players have continued to feel unchallenged. If Pathfinder is a delicious gourmet sandwich with a bunch of different parts on cheesy bread, D&D has become Uncrustables. Now, there's a place for Uncrustables. I know this because I'm a little autistic man who grew up with baby mouth and didn't like crust. It's simple, it's palatable, and for lack of a better word, it's a safe food. There's a time and place for safe foods, but when you're professionally pinholed into eating the same peanut butter and jelly Uncrustable every day, you're gonna start getting bored of it. It's looking like Wizards of the Coast is going to be moving on from base 5th edition onto 5.5e going forward, and it's kind of got me thinking about what I'm going to be doing going forward. I'm not as keen on 5.5e because a lot of the issues I've seen with base 5th edition are being exacerbated by it. Character building as a process is slightly changed, but the changes to the classes and the action economy aren't to my tastes. I don't care for the new changes made to Paladin, and it's still reflective of the game being unwilling to introduce new classes into the setting. Using Minecraft as an example, I don't agree with all of Minecraft's changes, but in the very least, they're going out of their way to introduce new mechanics in the updates which provides fresh combat methods. If Minecraft were running like D&D, instead of adding stuff like the spear or the mace, it would be like if they just kept adding different variations of the same sword. New subclasses for D&D are like adding a ruby and an emerald sword, rather than a new class, which is like the mace. The mace handles completely differently in combat and requires a different mentality when going into it, rather than just doing it with a slightly different flavor. We're getting new spells, but they're for the same old classes, and that's boring. Here's the thing. I'm not delusional enough to believe that my D&D campaigns are some groundbreaking entertainment. In comparison to stuff like Evantris or Critical Role, my stuff is mid at best. And who knows, maybe after a little bit I'll just quit making TTRPG content and move on to something else. The only reason why I'm making this content to begin with is, outside of my income, I just want to make something that feels like you getting together with the boys and having a good time. At the end of the day, I think taking myself less seriously actually makes my content more entertaining because it doesn't fall into the same polished crap that we see nowadays. A piss take is way funnier than taking everything seriously like everybody else in the room, especially in a world where professional production quality is the expectation for YouTube nowadays. Hell, even this video, despite being scripted, is just me sitting down at 4 in the morning and following the stream of consciousness and just kind of laughing at my stupidity. Because at the end of the day, everything I'm saying isn't gonna mean shit. I mean, think about it this way. Anybody who made it this far is probably just gonna click away and move on with their day. The odds of people commenting on this or taking anything away from this video are pretty low. I mean, especially if you're using it for background noise. Hello, this is your check for your ADHD. However, I'm also a man who has to pay bills. I mean, I'm forever cursed to owe blood to the American healthcare system, which is where I find myself at a crossroad because, like, D&D helps pay my bills. Dungeons and Dragons is the most popular TTRPG in the niche, and while Pathfinder is pretty close, it's a lot harder to earn a living based on systems that people are less familiar with. Like, sure, we do have Dropout popularizing stuff like Kids on Bikes, which is simple in a good way, by the way. Like, Kids on Bikes is unironically the opposite of D&D's problems because it's so simple that it allows for a lot more freedom, and your character limits are based purely on the setting your DM lets it take place in, rather than falling into D&D's rigidity. But from the perspective of someone who streams on Twitch, there aren't dedicated categories for Pathfinder or Kids on Bikes. For a bit of context, while cross-promotion is the main means of growth for Twitch, a portion of viewership and interest in streams and VODs are a direct byproduct of your stream category. It's how the Twitch algorithm puts out VODs and active streams. So when you're a full-time content creator like me, you have to take a lot of time asking yourself what you're going to spend your time on to help you grow. As casual as I actually like to play my vibes on stream and in videos, I do spend a lot of time behind the scenes doing clerical work and research. I'm always asking myself what subjects and games I could focus on, and it's a balancing act on focusing on stuff that I like and what's going to do well. So we have the option of me continuing to focus on D&D and just getting more and more bored with the content and potentially seeing that leak into the stories and effort I put into my work, or I consider moving on to another system that keeps me more engaged and challenges me at risk of it not doing as well. I could just continue using the D&D subcategory on Twitch and focus on something. That's not really the main issue. However, the main means of my income when it comes to streaming stuff like Tomb is that because of the semi-universal interactability through the cards, unless someone's feeling particularly generous and subs to me on Twitch or drops a tip, most of my earnings through D&D are through Streamloots cards and people being able to directly influence the party's success or failures. Speaking of which, a big reason why I haven't burnt out on Tomb is, unironically, those cards. Tomb episodes don't actually do that well on YouTube if you haven't noticed already. They do pretty well on Twitch when it's actually live, and they get about the same level of viewership for me as my art streams, which are where most of my views come from. But if it weren't for the fact that I basically introduced a system that lets players and viewers kneecap my encounters, I wouldn't be having as much fun. I love when my players just absolutely cheese an encounter by pulling a frog card, or when my audience members drop a fireball on the enemies. It's been this consistent back and forth of me learning the habits of my audience and players, and just trying to find ways to make encounters more challenging as a developer. And that's not including the stuff like the chaos cards, the fact that my players have more control over the story. Like, a lot of the character growth and interaction isn't actually my doing. Drew Santali's whole thing is all on Spring and Iridia's part. It's something that I kind of like to call the RTVS principle, where you get together a group of friends who are just genuinely funny and like to dick around. You get a lot of funnier moments that could never be planned for or artificially created. I don't plan on stuff like Drew's getting obsessed with cheese puffs. That's Spring and I having one of our Mike and Sully moments where we dick around and do something really stupid. I'm 4,000 words into the script now, and it's kind of occurring to me just how much the people you play with really contributes to your experience as a whole. That's not to say that my other groups are boring, far from it, but more that your best campaigns are going to be done when you have good synergy with your fellow players. Even if the game's base mechanics are boring, you can have a good laugh, and it does a lot of the heavy lifting. I've talked about Curse of Farstrahd a bit on stream, and my players and I have been getting super hyped about it because we're going to be taking the silliness of Tomb and dialing it up to 11. If Critical Role is the serious Disney movie approach to fairy tales, Legends of Evantris is the Shrek approach in the D&D world, and I love it. I love the principle of taking fun tropes and making them even funnier, and I'm looking forward to making that campaign a thing. Now, the thing is, Farstrahd is going to be happening after Tomb, and we're expecting Tomb to continue into 2027 at the very least. And the reason why we've been getting so hyped about it is because when I sat back and really looked at how much work I've been doing for Tomb anyways, I realized that I could make a much better game if I just built it from the ground up rather than working within the limitations of the module. Instead of having to work on encounters that fit into arenas that might not be optimal for more flavored challenges, we can make a campaign that works specifically to what I have in mind, which is basically a parody of Disney World and a commentary on corporate America as a whole. Like, the only thing that ties this campaign to actual Strahd is Strahd and Irina themselves, and the fact that Strahd lends really well to the Farquaad principle of an egotistical man who thinks really highly of himself and thinks that he's, like, some romanceable guy. We're doing R-rated Shrek, where we say, fuck it, you're going to Fantasy Disneyland. If you like the Schminglish bit in Tomb, you're gonna like Farstrahd, and I think starting the campaign as a joke is the best way to do it. And the thing is, I'm not gonna lock myself into any decisions between now and then. Between now and the time that Farstrahd ends, I might have a revelation about D&D, or there might be something about 5.5 that actually interests me and lets me stick around. But something I've played with is the possibility of Farstrahd kind of being my swan song to running publicly broadcasted D&D. To be clear, this is D&D specifically. I've been cooking up an original TTRPG system that better suits my needs, and just provides the necessary freedoms I want my players to have. It's kind of like a mix of Call of Cthulhu and the Fallout TTRPG for those who are interested in it. If I can afford it and my players have enough interest, I might run a game in that system after Farstrahd. I'm not burnt out on streaming TTRPGs, but the limitations of D&D are really starting to show themselves. Like, I'm not the best DM by far, but I'm so tired of eating Uncrustables. The only issue with moving systems is that when it comes to homegrown stuff, you have to spend your time teaching people how to play it. D&D and Pathfinder kind of have the benefit of being so universal that people can kind of transition easily between the two. But once you move out of the D20 system, or you use attributes or mechanics that are new or change the flow, people have a harder time moving forward. And that makes it harder to make content with, because you kind of gotta work out the kinks of the new system, both on a developer and player side. No system we work with is ever going to be perfect, if we're being honest. I think a lot of people tend to misconstrue flawed for bad when it comes to game development as a whole. A game having problems is just a byproduct of it being made by humans, and going through the gauntlet of production. When I made the Halo video, as much as I can critique the quality of the output, my main issue is more with the lack of soul. It's why I would much rather play a clunky indie game that still needs work over a polished AAA game that feels corporate and cold. However, when you're trying to do a stream or run a narrative-based series, there's a certain bar of quality that I feel I have to hold myself to. There's a reason why I haven't streamed Fallout New Vegas since last I tried, and that's because the crashing as a byproduct of the game's flaws directly impacts the flow and quality of the stream. Now, scuff is normal for streams, and some streams are funny because someone will just deliberately try to break something. There's a charm in things going wrong, a catharsis if you will. It's ultimately just the question of, do I make something that I'm proud of that's a little bit harder to do, or do I take the easier route that helps me make money? And, well, with how things are financially, globally, and in the country, sometimes money ends up being the priority. There's a whole tangent I could write here about stuff like AI and the importance of quality and integrity of making something yourself, but I've also been writing the script for over 3 hours, and I really don't want to get into the existentialism that is my livelihood, constantly being under threat by our corporate overlords. I don't know if you want me to complain about AI, but I don't know, let me know in the comments. I have some thoughts on it that probably have already been discussed, but let's be real, no one's had an original thought. But that's a problem for future Miguel. Today Miguel wants cheeseburger. Subscribe so I can afford gluten-free beef burger.